Hello, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depends where you are. Today is the last seminar for this IIPP research seminar series for this academic year. And my name is Andreoni. I'm the head of research here at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. I'm also convening this seminar series. We are particularly pleased to have two distinguished scholars from South Africa to present today on such important topic. As usual, we will be giving our speakers around 30-40 minutes for their seminars, and then we will be moving to the more structured discussion, starting with our discussant for today. I will introduce them in a second, and then we will open the floor for discussion, questions, and so on. I invite you all to use the chat and to raise your hand during the Q&A session so that you will be promoted to the panel to interact with our speakers. As I said, we are particularly pleased to have Professor Fiona Tregenna. Fiona is the chair in the South African Research Chair in Industrial Development at the University of Johannesburg, and she has been contributing on the theme of tonight's seminar for many years and work on premature deindustrialization, structural change, technological change, and of course the broader South African economy has been among the leading contribution in this field. And she has recently edited 2 volumes, the Oxford Handbook of the South African Economy, and also an edited volume on structural transformation in South Africa. Fiona has been also collaborating over the years with several UN agencies, and she's been part of the Presidential Economic Advisory Council at the South African government. Fiona will present a paper with her co-author and collaborator, Dr. Elvis Avenyo. Elvis has a PhD from Merit, Maastricht, and he is at the moment a senior researcher at CRED, the Center for Competition, Regulation, and Economic Development at the University of Johannesburg, and also is a research associate at the South African Research Chair in Industrial Development. Elvis has done lots of work on this specific field and has a number of publications in journals such as Research Policy, Innovation and Development, and the Journal of Evolutionary Economics. And over the years has collaborated also in the UK with several institutions, including collaboration at Oxford University on these themes. So 2 distinguished scholars who are contributing to this literature and that will animate our discussion tonight. I'm also very thankful to Dr. Danilo Spinola, who is a senior lecturer at the Birmingham Business School, who has agreed to act as a discussant for this presentation. Danilo himself has contributed in this line of research, and we will talk more later about, in fact, how all these contributions are part of a growing community of scholars interested on linking structural transformation, technological change, studies around complexity, trade, digitalization, and so on and so forth. So without further ado, thanks so much again for accepting this invitation, and Fiona and Elvis will give the talk together, and starting with Fiona. So without further ado, Fiona, the floor is yours, and thanks everyone for joining tonight.
Well, thanks to you, Antonio, for inviting us, and to the team there at IIPP for pulling tonight's seminar together. I'm really glad to be here amongst co-authors, collaborators, friends, and looking forward to the discussions. So the paper that I'll be presenting with Elvis this evening is actually a paper that we currently have revise and resubmit with a journal, and we're busy with the revisions at the moment. So we thought that presenting it here as a work in progress will actually, perhaps give us some good ideas for how to strengthen the paper as we're revising it. So the topic of our paper is really looking at empirically investigating the relationships in both directions between innovation and export performance in African firms. And then in a couple of extensions that we will come to in the course of the talk, we look at how this two-way relationship between innovation on the one hand and export performance on the other hand is mediated or varies in terms of various sort of factors and dimensions. One of these is looking at whether foreign ownership in firms and firms having an internationally recognized quality certification mediate this relationship in either both directions. We also look at whether it matters whether a firm is a direct or an indirect exporter. So direct exporter referring to when firms themselves export, indirect exporter where they export through another firm. We also look at the differences in terms of product innovation versus process innovation. And we compare in terms of the firms in the manufacturing and service sectors. So those are some of the kind of nuances and extensions that we'll be looking at in terms of this broad relationship between innovation and exporting amongst African firms. So just by way of background, I think yeah, probably it's self-evident to this audience. But both exports and innovation are recognized as playing important roles in terms of growth and development in developing countries in particular. And we can think of this at the macro level as well as at the firm level. In terms of exports, some of the importance of exports lies in their role in terms of balance of payments, in terms of employment creation, building capabilities and upgrading, and so on. And in terms of innovation, innovation obviously plays roles inter alia in terms of firms' productive capabilities, in terms of productivity and efficiency, competitiveness, diversification, in the ability of firms as well as countries actually to adapt, and also in terms of entry and performance in international markets, which is close to the topic of this paper. And beyond the sort of broad importance of exports and innovation, we understand this as kind of being integral, as both being integrally linked with kind of structural transformation and catch-up. So both at the micro level, the firm level, and at the country level, when we look at the literature on kind of catching up and structural change, we can see that the contributions of exports as well as innovation in those processes. So notwithstanding this importance of innovation and exports, African firms, when we look at them in international comparative perspective, tend to perform poorly on both of these counts. I'm not going to go much into the literature on these, and obviously there's various measures out there, and we can debate around these measures in terms of comparative sort of indices of innovation, but we see Africa, and in particular sub-Saharan Africa, tends to perform poorly even at the country level in terms of innovation indices, such as the one which we've mentioned here, where only 2 of the countries, Mauritius and South Africa, featuring among the top 65 innovative countries, and sort of at the bottom end of that. And in terms of exports, whether we look at it at the country level or even linked with at the firm level, we see the Africa underperforming relative to other regions of the world in terms of even just the level of exports, let alone if we go into kind of export quality, complexity, diversification, and so on. And there's a literature which is a sort of background to this paper, which analyzes some of the factors behind this underperformance in terms of structural factors, macroeconomic factors, and so on. So against that background, we're taking a firm level perspective on this and looking at the relationship between innovation and export performance. So coming to some of the literature which is more directly relevant to this particular paper, I'm going to speak to 2 broad bodies of literature, which are really looking at the 2 directions of this relationship. So firstly, we see a body of literature which analyzes the effects of innovation on exports at the firm level here. So this is what we call kind of learning to export. How does innovation at firm level influence firms' ability to export and their success in exporting? And the key channel which is identified in this literature is the self-selection hypothesis, which is in a way a kind of rubric for a range of channels of this innovation-export relationship. Again, for instance, that firms which are more innovative are better placed to both enter export markets in the first place and having broken in of improving their export performance. And some of the mechanisms through this is that innovation can lower firms' marginal costs and improve their efficiency, so making it more feasible to break into and be competitive in international markets. It can also enable the kind of technological upgrading and product differentiation and quality improvement that allows firms to be competitive internationally. And this literature on the innovation-export relationship also distinguishes between product innovation and process innovation. Product innovation being particularly important in enabling firms to penetrate international markets through new or significantly improved products, whereas process innovation operating mainly through lowering cost of production, through better efficiency, and making firms more competitive internationally. And there's a body of empirical literature looking at this causality internationally, broadly pointing to a positive causality. But we do see sort of that this literature is inconclusive. It's mixed in terms of the type of innovation and also in terms of country context. Then looking at the body of literature in the other direction, so the effects of exporting on innovation at the firm level, so what we call learning by exporting. And the key sort of channel here is what's referred to as the learning by exporting hypothesis, which argues that by virtue of exporting, firms gain capabilities, skills, access to technology, and so on, that allows them to innovate. And this can be in terms of process, product innovation, or both. One of the mechanisms of this is that accessing international markets allows firms to raise their output, therefore increasing their capacity utilization and more broadly benefiting from realizing economies of scale. And again, this is a relationship which is quite extensively tested internationally, broadly positive evidence, but mixed results depending on methodology, country context, and so on. Then also bringing into this literature the mediating factors, which we analyze in this paper, which are whether or not a firm has foreign ownership, and secondly, whether a firm has internationally recognized quality certification. So we do find both of these factors analyzed in the existing literature, but less in terms of the innovation exporting literature, but more in terms of kind of the determinants of whether firms can innovate, and separately the determinants of whether firms can export. So for instance, in terms of foreign ownership, there's studies that look at how having foreign ownership in a firm can improve their export performance through access to foreign technologies, better understanding of foreign markets, and so on. And similarly in other studies, how this can promote innovation. For example, through marketing connections, through know-how, through realizing economies of scale, and so on. And in terms of whether a firm has an internationally recognized quality certification, again, there's literature on how this can improve firms' export performance, perhaps less so in terms of how it can contribute to firms' innovation, but perhaps as more of a signal of a firm's innovativeness. But the existing literature doesn't really systematically study these as part of this two-way relationship, which is the subject of this paper. And in the African context, there's very little evidence on this, and it's quite mixed evidence. So this is not the first paper which is looking at innovation and exports in a two-way relationship. There's an existing body of literature on this, including at the FIML level. And within Africa, or within the African context, it's I think an emerging area of interest. We've cited here two papers, one of them being a working paper, quite new papers, which are also looking at this this two-way relationship between innovation and exports. So coming to what we do in this paper and how we try to contribute to the literature. So as I've said, broadly, we're looking at this relationship between innovation and exports. We see this causality in the one direction from as firms learn to export through innovation. We also see the causality in the other direction in terms of learning by exporting. How just the fact of being export active can enable firms' innovation. So we're looking at this in a two-way relationship, and we'll come to how we model that methodologically in both directions. On the side of exports, we analyze it both in terms of export propensity, so whether a firm exports at all, and then for the firms that do export, their export intensity. So basically, how much exports account for how much of their total sales are accounted for by exports. We also distinguish between direct and indirect exports. So we're breaking down exports, I guess, in four ways: propensity and intensity, and for each of these, whether it be direct or indirect. In terms of innovation, by distinguishing between product and process innovation. And then we bring in these two mediating factors: foreign ownership in a firm and quality certification. And we test how these two factors may mediate the causality in both directions. And then we break our sample down to compare between manufacturing and services firms. And yeah, I could also mention that a similar subsample analysis that we're actually busy with at the moment as part of our revisions for resubmission is to also break down by firm size in a similar way. So we use firm level data sets that we construct from the World Bank Enterprise Survey covering 28 countries. And methodologically, we use a Tobit simultaneous equation and full information maximum likelihood model. And methodologically, we think that this is an improvement over some of the methods currently used in the literature, such as just a straight probit. Our data set, as I said, comes from the Enterprise Survey, covers 28 African countries, and it's just based on data availability. And in each case, we're using the latest available survey wave from the Enterprise Survey over this period. And we control for the differences in those years using time dummies. So all in all, we have an estimation sample of 9,600 odd firms in both the manufacturing and services sectors, covering 20 sectors within manufacturing and 9 within services. And we've got pretty good regional coverage from the various regions of the continent. I think I'm not going to dwell on our descriptive statistics here, but maybe just to kind of point out our key sets of variables here. So in terms of exports, we've got our overall export propensity. So this is a 0-1 dummy as to whether or not a firm exports at all, which we then break down into, as I've said, direct and indirect. And then for the firms that do export at all, we have our export intensity variable on a percentage basis up to 100%, which again, we break down into direct and indirect export intensity. And then in terms of our innovation variables, we've got our overall measure of innovation, where the firms introduced either product or process innovation over the past 3 years, and then separately product and process innovation. Our foreign ownership on a percentage ranging from 0 to 100, and a dummy for quality certification. And then, of course, our control variables that I'll come to. So in terms of our methodological approach, so one of the issues which we need to deal with on both the innovation side and on the export side is that not all firms in our sample either export or innovate. So first, taking the direction of learning to export and the determinants of export performance, we use a Tobit selection model, which is taking account of both the fact that only some firms in the sample do export at all, and also the fact that our export intensity variable is a censored variable. So we start with our selection equations of export propensity, which is whether or not firms export at all. And following that, we have our regression equation for the firms that actually do export, and the determinants of export intensity, including our innovation measures, as well as a range of control measures. Then coming to the innovation side, similarly, we model innovation in terms of whether or not a firm is innovating at all, in terms of our export determinants, as well as a range of controls. And in this case, so let me go back to the previous slide. In terms of exports, our export intensity is, as you've said earlier, a continuous variable. It's censored on the left and right side because it's only for firms that are exporting anything, so from 1% upwards up to 100%. Whereas for innovation, it's simply a dummy variable. Are firms innovating at all? Have they innovated at all, product or process in the last 3 years? And then separately for product or process innovation. So in these specifications, we're also including year controls, country and industry fixed effects, and then a range of firm level controls, including cost of labor per worker, sales per worker, so productivity measure, firm size, the financial and skills constraints on a firm, whether a firm is located in the capital city, and the manager's years of experience. So amongst the econometric issues which we've had to deal with is the endogeneity or simultaneity, which of course is a key part of our analysis because we are modeling this as a two-way analysis in both directions. And then particularly on the export side, the self-selection based on the channel in which more innovative firms actually self-select to export. So as a result of this, we specify the equations which I put up in the previous two slides. Together, we formulate it as a structural equation model in which we simultaneously estimate these innovation and export equations by maximum likelihood. And we think that through this method, we are trying to both address the endogeneity issues, which are actually inherent to this analysis in the way that we've conceptualized it, as well as generating efficient estimates. And in the innovation equation, we use R&D and training as exclusion variables. We're drawing on the resource-based view of the firm and related empirical literature. And we use a censored Tobit regression with the selection. I'm going to hand over to Elvis to go ahead with the results.
Thanks, Fiona. Continuing to the results, I would also want to mention that we estimate a set of the three equations by assuming that the error terms are recursive in a way that assumes that the export decision of firms are also linked to the innovation decision of firms, so that we do see some level of correlation between the three set of equations, and this generally also set of controls and probably helps with some of the endogeneity issues that are particularly identified in the literature. So this table presents our baseline estimation results on the relation between export and innovation. We do see here column A for the export propensity, and we have the columns B and C, where we introduce the two main mediating variables, foreign ownership and certification. each of the reported results, as Fiona has already mentioned, controlled for country, year, and industry fixed effects, as well as other key explanatory variables. So the baseline results for export propensity, which is column 1A, does show that we do see a very positive effect of innovation on the likelihood to export. And we do see as well that our mediating factor, particularly for ownership and certification, are both significant and positive. We do also see similar results for export intensity, where all the key variables of interest, innovation, ownership, and certification all have a positive effect on the share of exports sold in the international market. So sort of trying to explain some motivation for some of these results, we do see largely that these two results, particularly for export propensity and export intensity, are in line with the literature. And in the paper, we argue that a positive effect of innovation on both export propensity and intensity are due to the fact that innovation enhances firms' competitive advantage in foreign markets, one, through specific product differentiations. And these differentiations often emerge due to both product and process innovations, right? That leads to some level of efficiency gains that are achieved by firms in the production process. And we do see as well that firms with the higher sort of or percentage share of foreign ownership may have sort of a better access to a foreign market as well. And given that knowledge is essential for innovation activities and quality standards, firms that export tend to be more successful. And we do have an explanation as well for sort of the certification variable, where we argue that firms that have quality certification tend to be more likely to export and sell more exports, which indicates that they are better able to satisfy sort of the product quality standards that are required in the international market. So in panels 3, particularly in 3A, we sort of also identified both exports and then the certification to have significant effects on the probability to innovate. And in line with the literature, so we try to motivate some of these findings by saying that exporting firms may be better able to undertake innovation through the learning activities that they encounter in foreign markets. That implying or probably filling in and matching the hypothesis that we do see some learning from exporting occurring for firms that export. But I think that there is an important caveat that needs to be sort of highlighted here, is the fact that because we don't use panel data, we do not observe entry into international markets before firms innovate, right? So this relationship is quite instantaneous, but it's also in line with the literature that does use panel analysis for some of this analysis. So to add some level of understanding to our two-way relationship, we interacted our export and innovation variables with our key main mediating factors, ownership and certification. And the main purpose for this exercise is to enable us to identify if foreign ownership on the one hand and certification on the other hand mediate that two-way positive relationship that we've identified in our baseline results. So the literature on both foreign ownership and certification on either innovation and export is quite advanced. But we do see from our review of the literature that these factors are probably sort of controlled for us, just main explanators, but not as mediating factors. And that is also probably one in our view, one additions we try to make to the literature with this sort of analysis. So what our results show is that our results do show that firms that we do see that the probability of firms to innovate and export are conditional on both certification and the share of foreign ownership. And we do have a great sense that foreign ownership and certification both enhance the effects of learning to export, where we do see a positive effect of innovation on propensity to export through mediating factors such as ownership and certification. But as well as we do see the reverse as well, where we do see that the effect of exports is mediated through the two mediating factors. What we don't find is the fact that we don't see any empirical results when we look at export intensity. Okay. Yeah, so we do think that some of these results are quite intuitive. And then we are happy to sort of engage in the discussion as to how we try to explain some of these findings. So in what followed as extensions to the baseline results that I've been describing, we decomposed our variables of interest and ran sort of split sample estimations for both product and process innovations, as Fiona has already indicated, and then also compare direct versus indirect exports. But as well as we do this also for manufacturing and services sectors. So our results, in this slide, our results for the product versus process innovations does show that process innovation do matter for both export intensity as well as propensity, while product innovation only matters for export intensity. We explain this in the paper by arguing that the quality of product innovations introduced are largely incremental, particularly in the African context, and the new product innovations are mainly either new to the firm or new to the country, and hence they do have very little implications for export intensity on the international market. But we do see strongly that the positive effect of process innovation may be explained by the cost competitiveness that process innovations sort of generate for the innovation process, and hence sort of allowing firms to perform better in terms of their export shares in the international market. Our estimation results by sector are qualitatively quite similar in the next slide. Yes, so our results by sector are quite qualitatively similar. And so we do skip some of these results and probably we'll get back to them and when needed. So yeah. And then to sort of summarize our results on the next slide. Yeah, running too fast. To sort of summarize our results that do confirm the mutual relationship between innovations and exports, and to a large degree when we decompose both innovation and exports. And also, next slide, please. I'm running faster. All right, so this slide shows the manufacturing and services result, where we do think that the results are largely in line with the baseline results, and we don't actually see any specific heterogeneity between manufacturing firms and service firms. Okay, so to summarize, our results do confirm the mutual relationship between innovation and exports, and to a large degree, when we decompose our innovation variables and export variables into both product and process, but as well as direct and indirect exports. And we also identified the key role of foreign ownership as well as certification in reinforcing the positive relationships between innovation and export in African firms. So to conclude briefly, we do see that there is evidence or probably growing evidence highlighting the important roles of exports and innovation in driving Africa's economic development agenda. However, the majority of the evidence considers some these key variables separately. So what our paper adds to the literature is simply to consider this as sort of a virtuous cycle and synergies between export and innovation by considering the fact that these two factors may be reinforcing each other, and even more through firms that have higher share of foreign ownership and quality certifications. We believe that these findings have important implications for both trade and innovation and in extension industrial policies on the continent. And one in terms of the need to coordinate these policies, but also recognizing that translating knowledge and foreign technologies obtained through engagement in foreign markets, for instance, into innovations and vice versa, is not automatic, but requires very specific, targeted and deliberate policy and active policy recommendations. And we do see a strong role of AFCFTA in promoting sort of policy integration across the continent, but as well collaborations across member countries that are quite fundamental for the success of the regional market. I would like to end here. Thank you, Antonio.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much to both of you. I think it's a very interesting result. In particular, of course, what is driving and what is the dynamics related to certification. A few days ago, we were discussing how in international markets, of course, new standards, especially related to CO2 emission, will play a role in shaping the structure in global value chain. And of course, certification is becomes a key mechanism to overcome non-tariff barriers. And so very interesting results. And I think it's very important to have more works of this type done to see at least, of course, the broader patterns that we observe across different countries in Africa in such an important relationship. We'll have many comments, but I'll pass to Danilo, who is our discussant for today. Danilo, the floor is yours. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Fiona. Thank you, Elvis, for the great presentation. Thank you, Antonio, for the invitation. I read the paper. I had a lot of ideas, things that came to my mind. I think some of them will be mostly things that could be thought in the context of the paper and not necessarily like comments that are directly highlighted to the core of the paper. Because one thing that came to my mind right in the beginning when I was looking at the research question was, well, we're talking about the relationship between innovation and exports in the context of developing economies. And when we look at the innovation surveys, we see that most firms, when they say they innovate, they're really talking about importing machines, importing capital. So innovation for these firms are directly related to bringing things from abroad. In this sense, exports and imports are directly related because you need those resources. At least the firms that exports are usually the ones that have more resources, especially in foreign currency, to bring those machines and implement them. And that's what they call innovation. And that's what it says in the innovation service for the enterprise survey, probably the same. So things that came to my mind that this is a very important result because we see that this being discussed in the context of developed economies. We see this being discussed theoretically for developing economies, but we rarely see some good empirical work that try to deal with endogeneity, and that's why I thought it's quite interesting. But there's lots of things that came to my mind, especially because I'm not exactly a microeconomist. I'm micro, but I always macro. So I'm always thinking about the macro and meso and industry dynamics when I look at that. And this is what came to my mind. The first one is regarding this GVC integration. I mean, it's if actually these imports, if innovation is directly related to bringing things from outside, then the integration to the GVC directly kind of boosts the innovation efforts of those firms. So that's something that came to my mind. I maybe wrong, but that's why I want to ask if that we could like extrapolate the interpretation somehow in that direction. The other question is, it's something that in the enterprise survey we can't see, but it would be really nice think about is that the destiny markets of those firms, if they're exporting to the neighbors, of they're actually exporting internationally to a more like broad market. Because we see that, for instance, the pharmaceutical sector in Argentina, it exports a lot to Uruguay. So it exports a lot to Bolivia. So, but it doesn't go very much outside this niche, which increases the innovation opportunities, but in a kind of limited way. So this is kind of things that came to my mind. If you can somehow think about, because then we can have a multinational based in developing economy that managed to internationalize itself in a way that indeed it would be like these kind of things that we have in our mind, that the firm from developing economies that enter the international dynamics and become a national champion that can bring the innovation. This one thing that came to mind, like about the destiny market. Another one is something that I saw this in a paper that Antonio wrote on absorptive capacity of firms. Like, for instance, we're discussing about innovation and export, but then the firms with a higher absorptive capacity would be the ones that can mediate this process in a stronger way. Because then you can export, and if you don't learn from these exports, because you're not like, if you're just exporting for your neighbors around and just occupying some markets that are not being used, then this reduces this positive effect, which relates also to the maturity of the innovation systems, the capacity of the system to absorb, not only of the firm. So it has this mutual relationship, which gives some policy recommendations on this side, right? Because when we strengthen the innovation system, it created the capacity of the individual firms, and then the relationship with imports and exports could be stronger, is strongly mediated. And now other things that came to my mind now, which is the view of with a more like macro perception. Well, first, the role of multinationals, because we can see that if the firms that are multinationals being using the markets, either market seeking or resource seeking, we have been discussing that a lot among ourselves, but using doing FDI in those economies, creating branches, and these branches are being used in the process of passage inside the global value chains, then it's more like a firm, and we would have to see the spillovers to the rest of the economy, but they'll be in the individual firm that could drive this behavior, because the multinationals have this stronger absorptive capacity and possibilities of doing that. And now on the macro side, I think one thing that came to my mind is about when I'm talking about exports, two things directly come to my mind: balance of payments and exchange rates. So first is how exchange rates could somehow, it could be controlled, you know. That's something I had in my mind, because when you have like some volatility in exchange rate, or we measure 2 different points in time, I know it's a cross-sectional data, so but if we measure 2 points in time, the results might be driven mostly by the price dynamics and not necessarily to the quantity dynamics. And this is why this is the kind of thing that if I were the referee, I would think about, like, just thinking about in this mindset as a macroeconomist with a view referee, and also in terms of balance of payments, because when firms export more, you have higher likelihood of accessing the international markets to bring the capital goods. But on the other hand, and this is the discussion that people in the like Bressa Pereira have been doing on exchange rates and balance of payments, when you devaluate your currency, when you have a devaluated currency, you have the opposite effect. Right? On one hand, you don't import that much, but then you create competitiveness inside the economy, because the firms get more competitive with outside. So it's not about importing capital goods, but learning and then competing outside its markets. And then final, I have 2 more comments or 2 more questions. Those are mostly things that came to my mind. One on the heterogeneous results, because it seems like the results is like, it's very clear that you have a reinforcement of exports and innovation, which is a very, very clear result. And I was thinking with myself, could there be negative effects? What would be the explanations for negative effects? What could have driven, like, actually exports do not affect the innovation, or exports affecting negatively innovation? I was trying to find drivers of that. Through balance of payments, we could think about something like that, but just to make like counterfactuals in my head to see how we could discuss this result, because the results are very good, which is really nice, but we always have to think like, in my mind, I always think like, when it doesn't work, how should it be doing? And finally, I think it's more like a technical question, but a more technical question, try to understand a bit more the paper, because you have cross-sectional data and you are controlling for endogeneity. So what are the sources of variability in the enterprise survey that allow to control from this endogeneity? You have the selection and the regression equations, which allows to create this innovation latent variable. But how do you use it to control between the different countries? I think obviously you probably need to use the variation between countries, but that's something I wanted to, because I don't have the full panel to get the behavior on time. So you have to control the endogeneity in a more like vertical way, looking at perhaps we did it in other people with multi-level, but how did you do in this specific paper? I think I had comments all around, but I hope that could be useful to think about for the debate. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thanks, Danilo. Thanks. No, I think it was very useful to go through both technical aspects. Of course, in a number of these seminars, we go deeper into a number of contributions which are using cutting-edge sort of econometric techniques. So it's useful also to investigate how they're applied and go a bit deeper into that. And I'm also interested on your hypothesis, which is something that was also in the back of my mind about, we observe across African firms cases of functional downgrading, right? Where firms are not upgrading in terms of their capacity to be innovative, or process upgrading along value chains, especially in export activities, for example, in the context of garments or other type of low-tech type of products. So it would be interesting, as you said, if it was possible to capture potential diverse type of patterns or counterfactual in terms of downgrading, not only upgrading. I think we do not have questions from the audience so far, so I invite the audience again to post questions or raise your hands for raising questions while we gather more questions. Fiona and Elvis, would you like to start with responding to Danilo, and then we have Kino already raised his hand, and we will pull together 2-3 questions together. Please, whoever would like to start.
Go ahead, Elvis, if you want.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Danilo. We've had some of these discussions in our private engagement, so they are very useful, particularly for this paper. I would like to touch, probably based on the same sequence you used, react to some of the questions specifically. So the first on about the innovation activities around importing machines. So the Oslo manual on which the enterprise survey is based and probably is collected, it defines innovation quite broadly, right? So you would see that an innovation activity of a firm, according to the Oslo manual, actually includes the introduction of new machines or new technologies. So in that line, I completely agree with you. And so what that means is the way we are probably capturing innovation here might as well even be more endogenous than with exports than we think. And for me, I think that is why it is also essential to sort of undergo this sort of robust econometric analysis to try specifically to sort of control for the endogeneity issues and as well as the selection issues. And of course, that also does touch on the functional diagramic comment by Andreoni, right? So it might mean that firms, let's say the textiles industry, for instance, firms can be downgrading in terms of specific technologies, but what is captured as innovation in the enterprise survey might simply just be that they've imported new set of textile ranges from China. That as well comes in as a product innovation. So those issues won't be directly captured in the data, but we do think that this brings into question the sort of the methodology used to collect some of these data sets. And I do think that this also comes to play what we need to do going forward in terms of specific industry sector level studies on some of these specific issues, right? And also possibly questioning the methodologies that some of these sort of databases are based on. So yeah, I do take that specific point. On integration of GVCs boosting innovation. So in the GVC literature, you do know that even some empirical works refer to exports as forward linkages. So if you just simply consider our export variable as a forward linkage, we are already in the realms of GVC discussions, right? We just decided not to use a GVC terminology here because I fundamentally just don't agree that export naturally measures sort of integration into divisions naturally. But yes, I do see some of those linkages coming there. On destination markets of firms. So one of the comments we received from the reviewer about the possibility of us analyzing the specific markets that these export goods are sold. I've actually checked, and the enterprise surveys are quite sort of deficient in the specific markets into which some of these products are sold. But I think a good data on that would be very useful. And you might also see that there might be specific innovation activities or there might be some heterogeneity in the innovation activities that occur across different markets. Yes, all we could do is possibly also try to use different proxies that sort of measure this for analysis. And I do agree that might probably add to the sort of story we are trying to tell here. On absorptive capacity of firms. So Fiona, myself, and Erica, we actually have a paper in the EJDR that Antonio edited on the effect of productive capabilities on export performance, right? And we used, I think it was published in 2021, I think, yeah. And we used data for 29 African firms, and we used so that the enterprise survey. What we did in that paper is simply decomposing capabilities into both technological capabilities and productive capabilities. And we identified that both forms of capabilities are important for the probability to export, as well as the export performance. What we didn't think about in this paper is possibly adopting that sort of measure we used, and then trying to see how it mediates the two-way relationship. It's an interesting, that could be a very interesting paper on its own, I can tell you. Possibly a new area of research that we should probably just build on and probably try to leverage the sort of thing we've already done here. But I do think that it could be something very interesting. But we do control for human capacity as one of the variables, but it's different from productive capabilities and the way we measured it in our AJDI paper, right? So I think it's an interesting suggestion that we can possibly look at. Okay, so I'm going to jump onto the last one on the sources of variability for endogeneity. Yeah, so the way we endogenize export and innovation and the way we try to control for it is simply by going old school macroeconomics, where we endogenize both variables, right? So if we take, let's say, a consumption model, like a very Keynesian macroeconomic model, right? And you have a variable like, say, consumption equals a specific outcome. You can as well endogenize it by introducing consumption as part of that model, right? So that's sort of the formulation we sort of try to follow. So we endogenize both models by introducing export into the innovation equation, and as well as innovation into the export equation. But what we added in terms of the sort of the analysis is to make the error terms in both of these equations recursive. That also takes into consideration the fact that even though there may not be endogeneity or there may not be simultaneity between the two variables that we are considering, the error terms might still be endogenous in the fact that some of the variables that we are not able to measure or control for in our model that assumes to be in the error terms might be correlated. So the recursive model also probably enables us to further control for some of the endogeneity issues that may occur. And if you check in the paper as well, you would see that the correlations between all the three equations are quite significant, indicating that there is some level of sort of recursivity in the error terms, and the approach is quite correct and robust. I'll hand over to Fiona.
Yeah, thanks. Just a couple of additions. In terms of balance of payments and other macro factors, in this case, it's not a multi-level analysis, but we do have the country fixed effects. So I think that's really the way in which those macro level factors are kind of absorbed to some extent. In terms of kind of what would be a counterfactual, or what could be a negative or a non-effect. So, I mean, across all of our regressions, we don't see any negative coefficients between these. We do see non-significance in a couple of cases, or weak significance in a couple of cases, but we don't see anything being negative. I think perhaps what's interesting in relation to the kind of consistent positive and significant effects is that this is, of course, controlling for other relevant firm level factors, right? So we've got in there factors kind of proxying for productivity, for efficiency, for skills, for managers' experience, and so on, which in a way would be, some of the channels through which we would be expecting this two-way relationship to operate, but that even controlling for these, we're still finding the persistence of this two-way relationship. So it's suggesting that even once one factors those in, there's still this sort of independent effect of exports on innovation and innovation in the other way around. So I think, we wouldn't have been expecting negative results, but I think that it's a significance, which is perhaps interesting how strong that is. And then linking that to the issues around absorptive capacity, I think this is an important point also in terms of policy implications, that in either direction, the benefits, as it were, are not automatic. Learning is an active process, whether it's learning to export or learning by exporting. And just by virtue of exporting, if there's not sort of an active orientation of the firm towards kind of garnering insights from that, garnering knowledge, skills, and so on, and actually doing things differently in your production, whether it be in terms of what you're producing or how you're producing it. It's not that you're automatically just going to upgrade or jump up to another part of the value chain and so on. So I think that's interesting in terms of sort of the policy implications. But at the same time, having said that, I think that the strength of the result and sort of the consistency across specifications and across samples and so on suggests that there's also just independent benefits just from the mere fact of exporting. So I mean, amongst our sample, presumably we've got firms which are more or less kind of learning oriented, active, and so on. Amongst the innovations, some of them are probably really novel, some of them are not novel at all, and so on. And obviously the results are kind of averaging across that. But the fact that they're so strongly consistent, suggests that yes, we would think that it's important for firms to be kind of proactive and learn actively from exporting and so on. But it also just, the consistency of the results suggests that just the mere fact of exporting and controlling for other things, you kind of get benefits from that. You're more likely to be more innovative and the other way around. So from a policy perspective, it also suggests that maybe just, these learning channels need to be approached in an integrated way. And in some cases, governments have kind of more or less direct levers to promote either innovation or exports. It's not things that you can force firms to do, but that even exercising leverage on firms to do either one or the other is also in itself more likely to bring effects in terms of the other. These ultimately are kind of means to an end. I mean, innovation is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself for a policymaker.
Thanks, Fiona. I think this remark also points to the fact that, triggering sustained cumulative processes that you're trying to capture with that relationship, right, require really the practice of it, right? It's almost something that has to be into the machine needs to start rolling in order to start seeing potentially also then, diverging patterns, but in a sense, without that dynamics going. And I think as a fundamental implication in terms of what we understand industrial policy, because, there is this always idea that, you set up the conditions for, right? And maybe the necessary condition, maybe not sufficient for continuous upgrading and so on, but the necessary condition to be part of that game is to be, involved directly in exporting activity. So it seems that the old Asian and even before East Asian model of learning by exporting and learning to export still has, despite also the constraints in international trade. And I think all these elements reinforce that despite all the things that have changed, that machine of growth and expansion still works and still deliver that cumulativeness. I think it's an important result. Kino, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Fiona. Thank you, Elvis. Really great presentation. Looking forward to reading that paper once it's published. Particularly great that you were able to differentiate between process and product innovation. I was initially going to ask something similar to Danilo about the destination of exports, but I think you could almost also argue or question what about the origin of ownership. Which I guess goes sort of in a similar direction of MNC ownership. And then the two other questions I had were, one was if you think you could somehow account for context-specific policy issues, so whether or not there's some kind of export promotion or kind of R&D support for firms. And the other question I had, just when you were talking just now, Fiona, about the fact that learning is a dynamic process, I wonder if you can somehow, I don't know, incorporate or account for the changing importance between, or sort of what comes first. Is it, do you need to be innovative first or do you need to export first? And then how does that maybe change over time, if you could somehow incorporate that in your analysis?
Thanks, Kino. Fiona, please go ahead, because I think we don't have other questions for now, so.
Thanks, Kino. Nice to see you again. Yeah, in terms of where the source of the phone ownership, again, unfortunately, we constrained by data. It's not there in the survey, but I think the similar logic would apply, and it would have been interesting to see that, does it matter whether the phone ownership is from an advanced economy, perhaps more likely to bring technology and skills and access and so on, as opposed to maybe a neighboring country and so on. It would have been really nice to explore if data were to permit it. In terms of the kind of the dynamic processes that you're mentioning, I think this would need a dynamic analysis, right? And in this case, it's a cross-sectional analysis at different points in time. We've looked into the possibility of doing some sort of panel analysis with this data set. Because to some extent there is a matching of firms between waves, but in practice for the countries within our sample, there's such a small number of firms that are matched between waves that it's actually technically not possible to do that kind of panel analysis that could pick up some of those effects. Which comes first in a sort of chicken or the egg situation, I think is a nice way that you put it, which is not possible to do. But I mean, maybe one thing which we could perhaps look at, Elvis, is sort of, is there an asymmetry in terms of the strength of the relationship? Perhaps, if you're in the two directions, perhaps we could think along those lines. And then, yeah, lastly, although it was actually, I think, the second point which you mentioned, bringing in sort of policy type dimensions. I think this sort of thing would be possible with a multi-level analysis. Actually, in a separate paper of myself, Elvis, and Danilo on a different but I guess related topic. Perhaps that's something that we bring in, actually modeling country level factors as determinants. I think in this case, all that we're bringing in is country fixed effects. because the covariates that we're bringing in are at the firm level, because we've restricted the analysis to the firm level analysis in this case. Elvis, anything else?
Yes, quickly. On the second point on the context-specific policies, yes, there are some questions on policies in the enterprise survey, but these are not export-specific policies, right? So it may be difficult for us to sort of pick those and assume they are export variables, and then. But I do think that the multi-level sort of analysis where we can identify some of these policies at the industry level or macro level could be useful in indicating to us some of these policies. There are actually some papers I remember on, I think, financial regulation, for instance, right? That so they analyze a specific financial policies that were enacted in different countries, not just passed, for instance, by Parliament or Senate, but also were actually implemented and how they heterogeneously impact firm outcomes. And I do think that there is something we can do there in this context as well, but I think we may need to identify the specific policies that are relevant for our analysis. On the learning and the dynamic process, yeah, following Fiona's comment, we're unable to do this particularly for this paper, but there is also some literature, particularly linking productivity and exports, right? And literally also is the fact that the relationship between productivity and exports and the literature is quite advanced. This literature dates back to several years. So people have used panel data to try to see whether productivity matters for exports or exports matters first for productivity. What is coming up more strongly often is a case that they do find the mutual positive relationship, but what is coming out strongly is the fact that the effect of firms being productive before they enter into the international market tends to be much stronger and often comes up much easily than otherwise. So I would also suspect in this case, if you're able to use a panel of data, that firms may probably want to be innovative domestically and then venture as a sort of a proportion of their innovativeness enter into international markets. But this needs to be explored with a very good panel data.
Thanks, Elvis. Thanks, Fiona. I think there are no other questions, but if I may, before I also give Danilo a chance to make his last remarks, if he has a few. You also mentioned you are at the moment trying to run the analysis taking into account the size of the firms, and of course this is a imperfect but still very important dimension to capture, to characterize heterogeneity at the firm level. And so maybe if you had already done any elaboration, if you would share with us what is the size, how it has been measured based on this data, and is it confirming the kind of expectation that we have in terms of scale economies, in terms of the role of these in export, or is something that even if you have not run the regression yet, what do you expect? What are the hypotheses here that would potentially increase the power of the explanation that you have of what has been happening?
Yes, absolutely. And it's also a key comment by the reviewer. So the way size is measured in the data is simply by number of employees, right? So we have small, medium, and large. I think in some cases as well, we have micro. We simply 0 to 9 employees, and then 1 to 9, and then we have 10 to 20, and then large being 50, and then greater than that, large. So we've done the one way, which is on innovation. What is emerging there is sort of also in line with the literature indicating that smaller firms tend to be more innovative than large firms. And the effect of exports tend also not to be very heterogeneous, but tends to fall in line with some of the evidences that are in the literature that given that the small firms innovate more, they tend to be increasingly exporting more. But once we integrate it with the mediating factors, some of these effects sort of die out, right? Because the assumption there is also that larger firms tend to have these established collaborations, and they tend to have some of these quality certifications, because they've been in the export market also for quite some time. So we do see some nuances also coming through there, but we need to finalize the results, and we do see, and then possibly see what we can make of it in terms of how it adds up to the current analysis that we have.
Thanks, Elvis.
Maybe just one addition is that even before the split samples that we're busy with at the moment, we have size as one of the firm level covariates in the regressions. And there does show up positively for both innovation and exports. And I guess there might be different dynamics that work. Sort of on the one hand, the small firms maybe being more agile, more innovative, and so on. Larger firms maybe benefiting from economies of scale and access to finance and so on. So, yeah, I guess we'll watch this space in the final paper.
Of course, it would be interesting to see if there are, typologies of firms, right? So different pathways to enter into the exporting, learning, innovation dynamic, and so if there are also measurable capital intensity or some form of capturing the different type of sectors or potential products, and so how process and product innovation might work in that space. Danilo, you have a couple of minutes if you want, 2-3 minutes if you want to add a few remarks, and then again I invite anyone in the audience who would like to ask any further question. Otherwise, we will close after. Danilo.
Thank you. Yeah, things that came to my mind now during the discussion. One of them is regarding like the interaction between ownership and size, for instance, because then we can see that the role of the multinationals on the, because one of the things that in the end of the day we end up capturing, and it's nothing that is much anyone can do about that, is like we are already getting the exporting firms. So the exporting firms are usually the ones that start at a higher level of capabilities, at a larger size. So and because we can't see the entry and exit of firms, we can see this impact of entering and start exporting. We only see like change in exports. But, so my question, and I know you've done some of those interactions, but if you see that these kind of interaction could drive a bit more the results, like as in the sense that we see stronger results under certain specific interactions going on. For instance, size and ownership, foreign ownership and size would drive a bit further the positive results. I wouldn't expect them to be insignificant, but at least in terms of which ones end up being in stronger magnitude. Just comments and questions that come to you during the discussion. Yeah.
Thanks, Danilo. Thanks. Elvis and Fiona, one last round of comments, reflection, and then we close. Elvis, please.
Yes. Thanks, Keno, as well for your comment on the tech intensity.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think also that there are several dimensions that we could split the data into, right? But and that this links to Danilo's comment. At a point, we need to say, okay, fine, this is enough for this paper. Let's pack the rest for the others as well, right? And I do think with the size interaction, we should be able to capture some of that with a split sample by size. That should be able to tell us some heterogeneity across the different compositions of size, how ownership and either innovation or export sort of interact across the different specifications. Yeah, but I think there could also be different ways that we could rethink these paper, particularly probably these being the base, and then rethink and probably recombine some of the different ideas into something else, right? Into a new paper or something else. So there are a couple of ideas, and we are happy to explore some of this even going further. And Antonio, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Fiona.
Yeah, from my side, just to say thanks, Danilo, for reading the paper and for your great insights. We've jotted down a whole lot of notes here, and it's definitely going to help us in strengthening the paper, as well as, I guess, future research agenda and spin-offs. And thanks, Antonio, as well for the invitation and for your comments, which I think in particular help us to kind of sometimes take a step back from the technical details and situate it again within the broader kind of structural change and catch up literature and so on. So yeah, thanks everybody.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Fiona. And let me use this occasion also to say that SARC has been very active in organizing several conferences. I think there is going to be one coming on structural transformation in the African context in collaboration with the INET as well. So I see quite a few PhD students also with us today. Fiona, if you want to say anything about that. There are going to be plenty of opportunities. So I invite you to have a look at the SARC website and the CRED website, who works very closely with the University of Johannesburg with a number of us. So thanks again for being with us tonight, and all the best, and we will be continuing this conversation.